Welcome to the Truth About Ag. Welcome to the Truth About Ag podcast, distributed under the Real Agriculture Media Network and powered by the Heber Group of Companies. Remember to like, share, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And today we've got a new guest like we usually do. Lisa Ashton from RBC. So before I give your biography, we've all read the reports, the 4.0, and then obviously the new one that came out in the last few weeks. So that's more where we're going to take this podcast. I want to talk about the reports. Obviously, I want a little bit of your background and the thought leadership piece, but that's where we plan to discuss most of it today is on the reports that are coming out, because that's what most guys are reading. So Lisa Ashton hails from Kent County, Ontario, grew up on her family's grain and oilseed farm, PhD for her work in the field of agriculture sustainability. Hebert, you got a PhD? I don't got a PhD.
No. I'm not
Former
smart enough.
recovering accountants here. We do not have PhDs. Former job as the sustainability and environmental lead at the grain farms of Ontario, and now part of the thought leadership agriculture policy lead at the RBC Climate Institute. Did I screw anything up?
Maybe just the end there. So I'm the agricultural policy lead on RBC's Climate Action Institute team, which is housed within RBC thought leadership team.
Perfect. Okay, I get to give the softballs, and then Kristjan gets to hit you with some harder questions later. So, first one, no, not at all. So, first one, I want to start with we've obviously seen the RBC reports. What prompts RBC to launch the Food First report, and then obviously, what are the key objectives you're trying to get out of this?
So this research has actually been underway for several months in collaboration with the Boston Consulting Group. And our objective at first was really to identify how the agricultural sector can grow through exports. And then fast forward to Trump inauguration and tariff threats, it kind of repositioned and re-elevated the importance of this type of thinking and strategizing and therefore the report. And then when we looked at the results and you see kind of we have heavily over indexed to the US. When we were first looking at that, it's like, that makes sense. Proximity, integrated supply chains, really strong relationships. But now when we look at it, it's like, okay, this is actually a pretty big risk and vulnerability given the current politics and context that we find ourselves in. And so that was really the context of the report, looking at where we can grow. That's still of the aim and identifying trade diversification opportunities. And then moving forward, Kristjan, I think, is really keen to understand and drive the conversation forward and how we actually do that and put ideas and thinking into practice.
So why from my standpoint, why is RBC doing this thought leadership piece? Because we've talked to JP Gervais and we've known the other banks. Obviously, we have good relationships with a lot of them just through the business side. But why does RBC bite off on some of this stuff that's above and beyond just being a national bank?
Well, I think we add a bit of color to that, Lisa, right? Like, so we had Stackhouse on 3 or 4 months ago. And so, it's not typical for a bank to hire a former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail to be part of their leadership team, right? Talks to Dave Mackay regularly to build thought leadership. Like, it wouldn't be something that if you asked a general population or even someone in the business world, hey, would you expect John Stackhouse to be on RBC's leadership team? And the main reason is thought leadership. I don't think that would be a typical answer. I have my reasons why I think it's great, but I'd like to hear yours.
Yeah, so I think kind of going back to the fundamental bit of that is RBC is a big company in Canada, one of the largest financial institutions. And so for RBC success, it is very much reliant on the prosperity of Canada and the growth of Canada and the success of Canadians. And so that is really the driving force of our thought leadership. How do we generate ideas? How do we convene people to identify ways for us to be better, ways for us to grow? because ultimately that is the driving force for the Canadian economy and trying to move those ideas forward. You think about kind of those transformational export opportunities in transportation, but there's other ideas that we want to uncover as well. And so this thought leadership team has the opportunity to really go at those at full tilt and really try to uncover new solutions and new ideas. And then for agriculture, I think when you think about why we're involved in that, again, the agri-food system is nearly 10% of the Canadian GDP. And I think that gets overlooked a lot when we think about kind of economic strategizing at a national level, and then also just kind of the general Canadian consumer. I think we sometimes take for granted how important that is to our country's growth and prosperity. And so that's why my role exists in terms of bringing forth those ideas and being challenged by our stakeholders like yourselves and debating in terms of how we can actually move things forward. So fundamentally, it's agriculture and obviously the economy is important to Canada, and so therefore it's important to RBC.
So I think what's the most surprising, and I guess for those that haven't read the report, it's on RBC's website. Obviously, it's the Food First report. They release these every few years. I mean, the first one, Kristjan and I both read, it was based on HR and technology, and that drove a lot of what we've done over the last few years. And obviously this one's more on the international trade and all that stuff, which again is going to drive a lot of what we do. But what's the most surprising things you're finding and unexpected, I guess, from the report that maybe threw you a curveball or two?
The most surprising thing, obviously we knew we had the US as our largest trading partner. It's very important to the Canadian agri-food sector as a customer. But when you look at our diversification and you compare it to other countries like the US or Brazil or Australia or even those within the EU, we are by far the most heavily indexed to one customer. 60% of our export value goes to the US, which translates to us making up 20% of their agri-food imports. But when you think about now in the current situation that we're in, and I mentioned this earlier, that it now brings forth kind of the vulnerabilities of our trade and export strategy. And so that to me is maybe not the most surprising, but once you get into like how big those numbers are, that is surprising. And that now kind of brings to light the challenge that Canada now faces with its relationship with the US.
Go ahead, Heebs. I know you're frothing at the mouth.
No, it's good. I mean, I was, well, you were there too, Lisa, right? We were in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago, and it was Amanda Lang that said, really, our relationship with the U.S. had turned into a marriage, right? I think lots of countries treat their trade more like a family, and you spread it out, between siblings and cousins and uncles and aunts, and we had just decided we're going to get married with the U.S. and now we haven't figured out if we've just hit a rough patch, if we're getting separated, or we might even get divorced. But it's probably reminded us why diversification is important, even if they want to continue to import as much as they always have. If we still diversify our trade, it should make the pie bigger because we'll have to export more in order to satisfy those other agreements. So completely agree with you there, right? The reports too, Evan, I mean, I think it's interesting that the banks are focusing on agriculture as much as they are. And I think it's fantastic. It has kind of been a forgotten, entity of
stepchild.
Yeah, I have used the word stepchild before, right? Redheaded, maybe even. That I think the productivity reports help bring light on again, right? It basically said agriculture, energy, and critical minerals is what's going to drive the Canadian economy in the future, and what do we have to do to be able to ascertain that and capture those. So I guess when I go to the report and we'll get into some ideas after. So Lisa and I talked about this before it even launched, and I said, I love all the information. I think it's fantastic. We got our key takeaways. We've got our key things we need to do. What the hell are we going to do about it? So let's maybe quickly review, Lisa, the key takeaways from the report, and then the 5 key areas that you guys have pushed forward as this is what we need to focus on for the next decade to capture this, if I remember correctly, $44 billion opportunity. And then we'll have some fun, maybe dreaming up ways and seeing if we can't get you in trouble with Stackhouse of what we're actually going to do about it.
Prefer to avoid the latter, but in terms of kind of the key takeaways, we did talk about it a little bit in terms of how we've indexed to the US. And obviously we have formed a really strong relationship. There's significant benefit to trading with someone that is the largest economy in the world and your next door neighbors. Like, we can't deny that fact. I think that Canada has done very well in terms of expanding into that. But now when we look globally over the last 25 years, the world is in general kind of passed us by. We've seen emerging economies like Brazil and Chile and Ecuador really start to hit their stride in terms of productivity and export sophistication and marketing and promotion. So with that said, we've gone from fifth place in the early 2000s to now seventh place on the leadership board of agri-food exports. Our modeling in partnership with the Boston Consulting Group shows that if we continue on a business as usual trajectory, we risk falling to ninth place by 2035. And so all of these rankings, what does that actually mean? When we dug into the numbers and where we have lost market share, it actually has material loss in terms of billions of dollars foregone. So when we looked at where we actually lost market share, if we would have had maintained those by 2023, it would have been an additional $23 billion to Canada's export. So that when you look at those numbers, that obviously paints a more realistic and tangible picture of what it actually means to not keep up in the global agri-food export world. And now looking more forward, okay, how do we address this challenge, recognizing that over the next decade, yes, there's going to be more competition, like I mentioned, from those emerging economies. Our traditional competitors like Australia, New Zealand, the US, those in Europe, they are really advancing their fair trade agreements and optimizing them. So Australia, for example, now 23% of their agri-food exports are to Southeast Asia. And that is really a growing market opportunity because of population growth, but also GDP. So they're going to have more appetite for higher value products that Canada is well known for producing, like meat to vegetable oil to fresh produce. And so when we look at that kind of more complex, more challenging trade environment that we expect, we looked at, okay, so what is the actual potential for us to grow? And under a high growth scenario, we could expand our agri-food export share by 30%. So going from our 3.7% share today to a 4.8% share, which would put us back in fifth place. And based on current value, it would be an additional $44 billion to Canada's agri-food exports. And so we've looked at kind of historic reports. The Barton report is obviously the most noteworthy. It had that value as well in terms of what that growth could look like. And I think it's important to recognize that we're saying 44 billion today, but when we actually look back in 10 years, it's probably going to be much more. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. And then
you better be careful if history repeats itself. I mean, I think Barton, about 6 or 7 years after his report, ended up getting grilled in front of the Senate for everything he had done for them. So I'll mark that on my calendar.
Okay, thank you. Remind me in 10 years.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that is why we really tried to focus on the share, because that is a indicator that is constant throughout time that we can track and we can look back to and say, okay, value, of course, it's increased. We every year we're having record years, but what does that actually translate into our global positioning? So that is what we really tried to focus on in our report.
So I don't want to take your thunder, Hughes, but I got two questions from that.
Absolutely.
And my first one is, so what advantages do we have in the global food market from a Canadian standpoint to do that? And then the other one is just what policies right now are actually affecting that, and how do we reverse those? Because obviously something's holding us back or pulling us down. how are we going to go from the 3.6 to the 4.8?
So in terms of some of our advantages currently, we have pretty good fair trade agreements. We have approximately 15 that gives us access to more than 2/3 of the global economy. And so that is a real opportunity for Canada to optimize that existing agreements that we have on the table and those relationships that we've developed through that. The other big thing that I think for Canada that sometimes gets overlooked is how fortunate we are to be endowed with significant amount of natural resources. So when we were looking at kind of our key competitors in terms of primary agricultural production, the U.S., for example, they are way more heavily reliant on their water consumption. I think they're around 47%. We're around 11%. Then when you look to Australia, they're over 60% in terms of agriculture's extraction of fresh water. And then when you look at land, we also have a relatively small footprint for agricultural production. I think we're around 6% of our total land mass, whereas US and Australia is over 50%. And so when you think about kind of 10 years down the road, there's climate change, just more disruptions, which challenges productivity areas, opens up opportunities in other, which Canada modeling is suggesting is going to be quite favorable for. And then when you think about kind of the growing competition from land for energy production, these powering our love for AI, that has to go somewhere. And so that's another competing factor on land. And then obviously population growth and urban sprawl is another competing factor. So when you look at Canada and kind of where it's positioning in terms of agriculture production, it's actually very favorable. And then the other key component is we're very efficient. We have very efficient production systems. I think your farm is a strong example of that in terms of innovating, adopting new technologies where possible. And I think that is also a huge benefiting factor in terms of actually being a reliable, consistent source of high volume, high quality product. And then the policy question. Sorry, that's a long-winded answer, really. The policy question, I when we looked in kind of how Canada's budget for government support services was broken down, where we saw maybe a disadvantage that Canada has when you think about growing markets and expanding our global presence is our investment in marketing and promotion. It really pales in comparison to other large exporters. So I would say that is a key component. And being strategic about that, like you can't just throw money at that type of thing. If we identify where those growth markets are, if we identify what the growth product is that Canada really wants to promote, and then bring industry associations and key farmers and government together to actually have a very targeted approach around that, I think that is an opportunity in terms of kind of that growth thinking.
She left out infrastructure, but I'm going to let you have that discussion later.
I knew that was coming down the road.
But I think it's a good point, though, right? Is that sometimes we get in our own bubble of what Canada is, and we forget that, like, the amount of land we have as a percentage of the country is small, right? But we have lots of different soil groups, i.e., it opens up tons of crop mixes. We have an abundance of water in general. You know, friends of South and Swift Current won't always agree with me, but compared to most countries, we have a large number of acres that have access to lots of water. Most farms are at a minimum, you know, kind of a 3-crop mix, not real normal in the rest of the world, right? Those are big deals. We just haven't done a great job of tying what we're good at to the multiple trade agreements we have, right? That we haven't got the outcome. And then the other thing I always hear is, how do we turn everything into canola, right? Why don't we sell all our wheat as flour? Well, we probably need to do a good job of asking our customers what they want, right? So if a European customer already has all their flour mills, they want to buy wheat, they don't want to buy flour. So what other opportunities in the value add world do we have that can be like canola and canola oil? You know, that's the one everybody talks about, but I don't think we've maybe necessarily done a good job of figuring out what the world and the customer wants from a value add perspective, and then being very targeted on that. We just talked that we should always do a bunch more value add.
Yeah, absolutely. And we did some case studies on some leading Canadian companies like AGT, McCain, and Maple Leaf Foods. And a key component of a lot of their growth approach is those relationship building and understanding what customers actually want. And when we looked at Maple Leaf Foods and even McCain, they set up offices in foreign countries to have those relationships to actually know what people want. And so I think that is a key component of that market promotion and development as well.
Yeah, some sort of a targeted approach on Kristjan's frustrations about to come out. So, I mean, I think when we hear people that have done it well, you just said, those three companies, and they have offices in those countries to build the relationships. At the Asia Pacific Business Conference just a couple weeks ago, Saskatchewan got brought up good again for how good of a job they've done, in that circle with their trade offices. Nowhere in here have I heard that, the Canadian federal government's done a good job of helping out with these offices. And I don't read very often that they're the leaders on it. So I think that's one of our areas on policy. I brought this up when I was at COP, is that we somehow need to get the feds, the provinces, and the companies to work together. I mean, I don't know, but if you're in Singapore and you walked into a big building with a big Canadian flag on it, and then there was an office for Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, whichever provinces want to be there, and the 5 companies that do the most business there, it kind of sounds simple to me if you're a customer to go find out everything you want to know about Canada and what it can provide. But it obviously is more difficult to that because we seem to be having trouble with it.
But I heard we were Team Canada. Am I wrong?
We're working on it. We are in hockey.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I would say when we looked at kind of what the U.S. has done in relation to that market development and promotion, they do have those foreign offices. They send massive delegations to markets that they want to expand in. And so while Canada may not be able to compete with that on a pure budget perspective, I think there are opportunities to be quite savvy in how we actually do that. And to your point, kind of those public-private partnerships and setting up those types of offices or foreign presence or delegations and being very, very specific in who we want to target is what we found to be a key opportunity moving forward.
I want to take this moment to give you a little highlight on one of our sponsors, Maverick Ag Consulting, providing the link between primary producer agriculture and the business world. Maverick offers specialized financial and operational consulting products that allow farmers to navigate the current farming environments. Looking to take on more dirt, an expansion in equipment, or just lay down a strategic plan for the farm? Maverick provides you with specialized resources and tools to take the gut check and emotion out of decision making. If you are ready to take the next step in your farm's definition of success, reach out to maverickag.com for more details. And back to the truth about ag. So is that a Canadian issue or is that an industry issue, Heaps? Are in other industries, do we have those offices in different countries, or is this a whole Canadian issue?
That is outside my wheel.
I didn't throw it at you. I threw it at him.
He's trying to get me in trouble for this.
I'm trying to get him in trouble.
Yeah. So my personal opinion, not backed by a whole bunch of data, would be that it's a leadership issue, right? You take companies like AGT, or I was on a panel the other day with Kirk Boston, the former CEO of Richardson. They, after the wheat board went away, they sold wheat all over the world. So there's been companies do a really good job of it. I think that we've just had a hard time combining all those approaches. Like the example I used with Austin was that it was the Four Nations hockey tournament was going on at the same time, and we had the best players from all these NHL teams, and they all wore the Team Canada jersey. So it's not that they weren't representing their own team and their own family; they were also representing a country. But I don't think we have a national strategy on why you benefit. So why does Richardson benefit to really pump Team Canada when they're in Kazakhstan, right? They're selling Canadian wheat. They're not selling Richardson wheat. Mm-hmm. But we just have never had a strategy, which sometimes you don't even need that good of a strategy. You just need leadership and leaders that everybody wants to follow in both, in politics, but also in industry. So we had Kip Tom on not that long ago, right? Kip Tom, great farmer in Indiana, has a small farm in Argentina, good friend of mine. under Trump's last government, he was the U.S. designate to the United Nations for global food security. He took a well-known farmer and put him in charge of the U.S.'s representation at UN for global food security. I think that's a pretty unique way to tackle leadership, right? The farm community knew him, whether they liked him or hate him, it didn't matter. They knew who he was, and felt that he was probably 80%, on side with what they believe. So I think some of it showed it's just a leadership issue, right?
I was getting you in trouble, not her, so I'm okay with that.
Well, and I think the other thing too is, we go back to this, and I'll put you on the spot a little bit, Lisa, right? Because I didn't go deep into point number 47 in your report, but so we take automated steering and variable rate technology. So one of the ways we say we're going to get out of this is innovation, right? And the one thing Evan and I talk about quite a bit is that how we measure this based on how farms are qualified in Canada, which I was mistaken, Evan. It used to be $10,000 of gross revenue. Now it's actually just if you have any farm expenses, you're deemed a farmer. Because what if you buy a donkey and it doesn't create revenue for 5 years? You're still a farmer. Just picking on donkey farmers today. But so we got auto steer and variable rate at 27% and 16% respectively. Can you remember how you calculated that? Was it the number of farms that said they adopted it, or the number of acres?
The number of farms. And I know this is a pain point for you.
You're playing into his hand today now.
Yeah. No, but this is a leadership issue. It's not.
I'm with
so
you.
We actually make ourselves, because of the way we collect the data, and if you're doing a report like this, you have to use the data, because there's nowhere in that data you can go pull out the acres. So this makes us look really bad, right? Even if you did direct seeding, zero till, I think it still only comes in at like 65% or something, and yet of total acres, it's way higher, right? But
I've taken a beating on social media for this lately, so I just want to put in my premise that I agree with him on the fact that we have a whole bunch of rental agreements and a whole bunch of other farms that are included in these stats that shouldn't be, because they honestly do not farm. They're not hobby farmers. They're absolutely not farmers at all. So I'm going to take a little pressure off myself. I'm not going to say the $1 million that he used to say. I'm just going to say that this includes a whole bunch of landlords and non-farming entities that are throwing these stats off. So don't come at me for this. Okay, now
that's a desk farmer answer.
Now we can go.
That's a desk farmer answer.
Now you can continue.
Yeah. So I agree. There's landlords, etc., that haven't farmed in years. They're included in the report. So the reason I focus so hard on the million and larger is that you guys made this report, Lisa, so that we can capture a $44 billion opportunity, which is basically out of increasing productivity and the utilization of our trade agreements. If you don't have extra money left in your business to invest in your business, your productivity is not going up. That's just how life works, right? And so that's why I focus on the million in revenue and higher. It's just simple math, right? The average business has a 16 to 25% net income. So let's use 16 is 160 grand. If you got a family of 4 in Canada, there's not a lot of money left at the end of the day to invest back in your business. And if we need to increase productivity, your point number 2, right under innovation, I think, is capital. And some of that is the people making a bunch of money themselves to put into their business, right? I'm assuming you guys are going to tackle more access to capital.
This is a benefit to you, Lisa. He's quoting points, which means he actually read the report word for word. So this is
retweet it. There many things come across Kristjan's desk, so yeah, I'm soaking it in.
So let's combine kind of, obviously innovation is driven by capital. Your point number 2 is on capital. We all agree. My simple formula is time, brains, and money fix everything, right? So how are we going to encourage more money in agriculture, and why isn't it there already?
So I think one key challenge, especially with the Trump tariffs that we are facing now, and I think may be intensified over the next little bit, is that these tariffs kind of put a chill on investment into food and beverage manufacturing and setting up and expanding that capacity, and then investments into the agri-tech productivity or efficiency space, because again, our biggest selling feature for a very long time is that we have proximity and a strong relationship with the largest economy in the world. And with that maybe having more uncertainty around it, that creates a little bit more hesitation for investment in Canada. And so when we were looking at, okay, well, what does the next 10 years look like? Well, I think we really need to strengthen and diversify not only our trade, but our business case for why people should be investing in themselves in Canada, but why we should be attracting or how we should be attracting more investment. And I think going back to those case studies we showed, it's really that innovation that Canadian companies can have demonstrated and promoting that. I think Kim McConnell says this quite well. We need to get a little bit louder of what our successes have been, what companies have actually had really strong progress, not only in the US, but AGT, for example, globally. You've mentioned Richardson's, they have global success. And so pointing to those examples and saying that, yes, US is still going to be an important market, but we have Canadian companies that have had success in going elsewhere and getting very specific on exactly how they've done that, I think is a key component. So really just kind of getting louder and being more specific about where there have been successes. I think it's kind of this Canadianism thing that we do. We get really hard on ourselves of things not being perfect and lots of challenges. And of course, the taxation competitiveness environment, that there's opportunities to improve that. I think interprovincial trade barriers, that is super topical at the moment. That's another opportunity, but really trying to get more targeted in terms of where we have had success and being a little bit clearer about that, I think is a big opportunity.
Well, I mean, I've seen stats lately on the entrepreneurs number in Canada, which is honestly, it's plummeting right now. I mean, it's about 150,000 down year over year. So, I mean, you're correct. We're going the wrong direction when it comes to investment in business and building businesses in Canada. So go ahead, Heaps.
Well, I could talk about capital as long as you guys want.
And then
roll it forward.
On that point, we've heard a little bit more recently and maybe over even the last 10 years anecdotally in our roundtables and interviews for this research that there's a bit of a brain drain happening from Canada to the US with those startups. They have their early stages here. They may still even have their office here, but they're going to the US to access expertise in terms of Silicon Valley and what it has to offer in terms of a network, but then also to attract investment. So I think creating those ecosystems in Canada is very important, but has been challenging to do because geographically we're so dispersed. So where are those clusters that we can say to entrepreneurs, this is where you should be to grow?
Yeah, so let's start super high up, right? Is that one, obviously the hot topic's Trump. Evan, I'll put this on camera so that you can tell me how stupid I was or how right I was 10 years from now. I think 20 years from now we'll look back and what we're about or are going through and are going to go through for the next 24 months, I think might turn into the best thing for the North American economy and history, but it's going to be the biggest gong show maybe of our life for 24 months. The one real risk, I 100% agree with you, is if you're any company investing somewhere between $500,000 and $100 million in any type of production facility, and you operate on both sides of the border right now, you're put it in the US. And that has a long-term effect, i.e. forever, right? And so how do we encourage that capital to come back into Canada? Now, the part that's frustrating for the average citizen, I'm deeming myself an average citizen, is that we're blaming everything on Trump, but oh wait, we have a pro-Rock government that can't actually do a goddamn thing right now. So he's negotiating against nobody. Let's fix let's not let a crisis go to waste. So let's fix our problem, get our government back in order so that we can get into the negotiation. But then too, as I said, have you heard interprovincial trade talked about this much in your entire life? Because I haven't. Right. So let's also use Trump as in where he needs to be. Use him as the bad guy that we rally against. No different than a sports team does against their number one competitor. Right. So how do we tackle the entrepreneur thing, Evan? Well, one way is why do we always talk about startups or some foreign group bringing their company to Canada? Like, why don't we just go to the 5,000 best small businesses, call them that do 1 million to 50 million in revenue, and say, what do we have to do for you to be 10 times bigger? Because those are the ones that actually grow our economy and keep everything in Canada. It isn't a public company that's held shares or hold globally, right? One out of, I'm part of enough startups, like 1 out of 50 is successful. But the businesses that can scale up, so take it from $1 million to 100 million or 50 million to $1 billion, those are the ones that we really need to keep in Canada. And on top of that, like, not only how do we help them, how do we encourage them to do it? So Murad's a good example, right? I think billion plus in revenue. Him and I were we were talking the other day, and he had a line that said, like, how do we convince Canadian entrepreneurs to want to be the diner, not the dinner? Because it's like a goal in Canada, if you start a business, to sell it to somebody globally the minute it hits 10, 50, 100 million, whatever. And you're right. Part of it is that, we created this coffee chain called Tim Hortons to complain about other people's success, not celebrate it. Right? What if every day at Tim Hortons we talked about who are the top 5,000 entrepreneurs in Canada we want to support, and how the hell do we let them get more successful? Because that's how we all win. Is that crazy?
Okay, so two things, and then I want to bring Lisa back into the conversation. So
I'm enjoying it.
Yeah. So first of all, the startup is actually closer to 1 in 400. Just I heard that stat the other day. And then on the other side, I don't disagree with you. And putting it on video, go nuts. I think part of his plan in being Trump is that he wants change up here as well, because he's got a plan for all of North America. And by doing what he's doing, I think he's forcing us to do things that weren't getting done. And if they were getting done over decades instead of years. So I'm in agreement with you that whether he means to do it or not, whether we want to give him props for it or not, he's going to force enough change in this country that we're going to be better off for it. Just hold on for the roller coaster ride for the next 2 to 4 years.
Some days I want to believe he has a plan.
Then he speaks, and then some days I don't know. So
some days that he goes on Twitter.
Okay, Lisa, I want to pull you back because I want to touch on two things here, and I know Kristjan does too. So the infrastructure question from before, which is, how do we modernize it? How do we get money into it? How do we change? Because honestly, I think other countries see us as inefficient. And then I'm going to let Kristjan talk about the 5G and the interconnectivity question, which I think is top of mind for us, especially out in Moosomin, Saskatchewan, right? So let's start with the first one, infrastructure. What are we doing?
What are we doing? Well, I think one of the comments that has kind of stuck with me from our stakeholder engagement for this research is that in recent trade missions to Latin America, they had questions, and this was the main topic, about our reliability to get products to market. And so that is, I think, needs to be kind of a wake-up call for not only Canada's agri-food sector, but all exporting sectors, because we're all using similar ports, similar infrastructure. And so how do we actually work together to have some more transformational types of projects, like the tunnel at the Vancouver port, the bridge as well. And so those are kind of key large types of projects that require that public-private investment, cross-sector engagement. And so Kristjan and I have talked about this a little bit as well with Kyle Scott from Emmer Tech in terms of the existing infrastructure we have for funding. So the growth fund in Canada, is that an opportunity to look at those types of transformational projects? We have the national the Canada Infrastructure Bank, another opportunity to look at those projects more thoughtfully as well. But then there's also smaller kind of opportunities that are creating congestion and challenges in Canada's infrastructure, such as using our ports as storage facilities. And so how do we actually improve the speed and scale that we're moving containers either inland, or speeding up the the in and outflow of those containers? And so I think there's kind of a tier of types of projects, and then getting very specific on those is a need moving forward. There's an excellent report by the task force, or the National Task Force for messing this up, for supply chain, and they clearly lay out kind of the key things that we need to be doing to alleviate and expand our transportation infrastructure. And so really, I don't know if we really need a strategy. It's implementing the ideas that people have already put forth and have developed.
I want to pull you away from the Truth About Ag podcast to highlight one of our sponsors, Farmer Coach, the only entrepreneurial producer coaching program in Canada that offers leadership, finance, and operational training from the dirt to the boardroom. A producer program that focuses on entrepreneurial business practices and growth. An education program that links the professional services world back to the dirt and back to production agriculture. And a mass peer group of all the participants that creates a link and knowledge of both Canadian and U.S. agriculture. For more information, reach out to us at farmercoach.ca. And now back to the podcast. Well, and before you talk, keep just some stats out of the report because I have it open here. So Canada right now, the ports are average 2.7 days, while United States, Brazil, and Australia are 2.1, 1, and 2 days respectively. So just to give a little background to the inefficiency of the ports we have in Canada.
Yeah, and I agree with all the ideas are there. I would say the one thing is if it was put into a national transport and infrastructure strategy document that we signed off and says, this is what we're doing, then maybe we'd spend less time debating what should be spent on. I mean, we've been talking about the bridge in Vancouver for, 50 years. And instead we're going to prioritize 9 to 12 billion on a high-speed train for an area that doesn't have the population of Japan. But we want
it's Ontario. It's not Western Canada.
I never asked that. We're doing Team Canada. Team Canada.
Sorry.
Right? So that's where I think the one document, you need a document that lays out the top 10 points, so you need to communicate it so that the voting citizens, but as well as everybody's on the same page. I'm not saying they all have to agree with it, but they're on the same page, right? Number two, at some point in time, can we just quit being so polite and explain that part of our problem is the unions? Nobody wants to talk about it's not just infrastructure, it's labor too. Now, I won't go deep into it. I'm just going to bring it up, right? And then
knows how much kickback I'm going to get from this. Keep going.
Yeah, what's not my fault? I just show up. On infrastructure, this is something I'm pretty passionate about because, obviously, I think this is the number one thing for our country. So let's get the projects lined up that are important, and then let's figure out how we're going to do them and access capital. But there's been lots of kind of innovative ideas. One was the Bunge-Viterra merger. They just got told by the Comp Bureau there's $500 million they have to spend on the industry. Well, would the bridge be the best down payment? I'm not saying it's only going to cost $500 million. It's going to cost more. We also have some, I don't know if you want to call them crowns or government entities, right? You got FCC, BDC, EDC, and CMHC that make lots and lots and lots of money off the backs of real estate investing and business investing in Canada. Why don't we use that money to build up infrastructure that's good for business and real estate, right? Instead of it just goes into treasury and disappears to all the different places we send money to instead of investing in ourselves, right? I think there's a bunch of different ways. We just have to get aligned on priorities. And so that kind of falls back, to our leadership part, Evan. And I'll go back to an old example in Saskatchewan. I won't even pick on the feds anymore. So depending on which side of the spectrum you fall on Grant Devine, right, you could argue that the end of his career, there was turmoil and that's how he can be remembered. Or you could argue that he was a pretty visionary leader when it came to infrastructure and growth, right? Potash Corp, SaskPower, Cameco, those all started as partial government investments in Saskatchewan by the government, of which then I'm only half knowledgeable on it, but basically they were sold back to private in most cases for an extra tax, right? It's what do they call it, Evan? The potash, what do they call the actual thing?
I stopped listening. I was reading the report.
Okay. Well, it's not just income tax. Each of those companies pays, let's be honest, it's kind of like a tariff to the government.
A levy tariff, what do you call it?
A levy, right? So it's been done before, but you're not always going to be well liked when you do it. If it's a 50-year project, it doesn't always equate to being super popular in the 4 years that you're there, or the 8 years or whatever. And that's the hard part that we have to get figured out. Lisa, do you want to comment on that?
Do you want to carefully comment on that?
Yes. So I think just kind of going back to the report, these are obviously massive, like you said, multi-year projects that require transformational funding. And then I think what's kind of interesting about this research is that we did a lot of international comparisons to say, okay, yes, we need to grow, but what are other people doing to grow? And when you look at our investment in transportation infrastructure, we would basically need to double it from 20 billion to 40 billion to compete with countries just like the UK or Australia. So I think yes, we're kind of at a time where budgets will be tight, and that's a challenging conversation. But if this is an investment that unlocks the growth that we highlight here and then the growth for other sectors, I think that is a big opportunity for Canada and needs to be framed that way as an opportunity to not only advance our economic growth, but our economic security and our ability to actually be self-sufficient and how we're actually developing and moving things across the country is really critical. And so, yes, strategies are important, but kind of I think at the forefront of that, you need to make the case of why we need to make those investments and demonstrating through kind of these growth scenarios what's the possibility is a key opportunity to kind of open up people's eyes to what that could mean for Canadian jobs, for the economy at whole.
Which is no different than a business case, right? We need an ROI for what we're going to invest.
Absolutely.
So I had one more question, and it just came out in the report, and that's why I was reading the report. I'm looking at the graph, and you mentioned the marketing side that we have a low spend on. We spend 40% of our services budget on inspection and control. Why are we so high in comparison to other countries? Sorry, that one just caught my eye while I was going through it.
Yes, and that caught our eye while we were looking at it. And I should start by saying that the budgets in general are vastly different. So we broke it down by percentage just so that they were comparable. And you would obviously know this. Canada has a pretty strong reputation in terms of food safety standards, phytosanitary standards, and so on, and protecting kind of pest and disease within the Canadian context. But when we were looking at kind of how other countries are expanding and utilizing their inspection control as a tool to unlock those outcomes for market diversification and growth, it's really about using that as a way for standard harmonization and recognition between your trading partners. And again, Australia was a country that we noticed is very active in the FAO group that reviews these international standards and improves them over time. So looking at that as a way, not only as like a process-based way of these are our standards and we need to follow these standards, and which we found does relate, translate into duplication with other trading partners if this is Canada's standard and we still follow through with it, which is a challenge and creates costs. But how do you actually look at it from an outcomes perspective? Okay, so we want to export more to Indonesia. What do we actually need to do in terms of trade harmonization, or sorry, standard harmonization and recognition with Indonesia so we don't run into non-tariff trade barriers that restrict our export of wheat or canola, for example. So I think yes, we're spending a lot. We have a great reputation in that, but now moving forward and framing it within the growth context, how do we use it as looking at it through kind of more of an outcomes-based system?
Yeah, because it's 4 times the spend that we have on development and maintenance of infrastructure.
Yes. Yeah. So with that definition of infrastructure, it's not necessarily like transportation because that's out of scope.
Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Two
there
things.
is some discrepancies there.
Okay. 2 things though, Evan. One is part of it is the pie's too small. The U.S. services budget is just so much bigger than ours. So one, our government should just put more money towards it. The second thing, and I would completely agree with you, Lisa, is that in conversations with friends, in the grain shipping industry or the food industry, not only harmonization, but also we seem to take pride in doubling up. So there's the rules they have to follow privately in order to be able to ship to that country. And then we have 2 layers of government that have to double check the private work. So in what areas do we need, CFIA to just be the referee, right? And the person that comes in and does the audit to make sure that, yes, this was done right, versus there's a lot of times where we're doubling and tripling services where they're already meeting spec because they had to follow the private rule, and then they need they have to go through all the reporting again to get this check off. And I think it's just to do with, we say we need new technology. I would think the government probably should look at some harmonization of technology too.
Yeah. And I think that is a product of focusing on your process, not, okay, how do we actually reduce our costs and unlock opportunities?
Yes.
Which maybe we're talking to similar people. We heard that quite a bit.
So I want to softball this question to you, Heebs, and then you can throw it at Lisa. So we had a Zoom meeting yesterday, and Kristjan drove about 10 clicks in his truck during that meeting and dropped the call 4 times. So let's touch on the 5G side of it. And if we're going to technology and we're going to AI, what does that mean on connectivity? Because that's part of the report as well. So go ahead.
On dropping those calls, I have to make this comment, right? Is that every time I want to feel better about myself for service in Saskatchewan, I go drive in Manitoba.
Okay.
Right. Yeah. That's where I was yesterday.
Okay.
But Team Canada, it's just an interesting thing, right? I mean, so we're in the middle of nowhere. Yes, we have, decent 5G, but since we're close to the border, you want to talk about interprovincial. I mean, I laugh that we got to figure out all this interprovincial trade. I can't get cell phone towers to let my cell phone cross the border. And I live an hour from AA hockey in Manitoba, and I live 2 hours from it in Saskatchewan, and the border somehow matters. Like, it stops my truck from letting my kid play hockey in Manitoba. So our interprovincial is just so crazy to me, right? But specifically on this, we have to use Starlink in a few yards, which is fine. But we actually plowed in fiber to our 2 main yards this summer. And probably Evan and Jeff looked at me a little bit crazy at the time because we had to write a check for some of it. And my belief was that if we're just going to have this much increase in technology on the farm and the amount of data coming from the combines, we were going to need more service. And I think we went to 300, but we can open it up to, 10 gigs if we need to. But the company we met with is doing AI rock picking with the goal of, within a few years having it fully automated. So you fly with a drone or have cameras on your drill. That'll create your rock picking map, but eventually, hopefully, we just drop a swarm of robots off to go pick all the rocks. In order to have those maps on a 24-hour turnaround, I need a gig transfer service at my farm, which we can get because we plowed in fiber. There's I don't know.
Nobody else is plowing in fiber.
No, like I was crazy at the time, and
still are.
Yeah, that's fair. But so I'm not sure how much the world understands that in the world of business, like how we need to get the 5G gaps fixed. And that's still a decade ago. We should have had that done, right? Because if everybody truly believes in the new innovations and that AI is going to become this important, like that is massive amounts of data. Specifically, if you start using pictures, which in agriculture, a lot of our AI is going to be based on pictures of the land, pictures of the crop, pictures of the grain. Like it's massive amounts of data that 5G can't even handle. So I completely agree. We have to get this part done, but then like, how do we even take the next step?
Yeah. And I think, and this may go back to your kind of number of farms versus acres comment, but when we were looking at the data in terms of actual coverage of wireless connection and 5G connection, if you just look at Canada as a whole, we're very close to meeting our targets because it's based on household. But then when you look at the rural numbers, it's actually quite shocking to see the coverage and to see the access to those resources. And you absolutely have to have that if we're going to advance in efficiency. The AI tools that you're mentioning, we can't unlock that without the internet access. And my parents' farm in southwestern Ontario, even in Ontario, we have these problems. And so I think it's really, and it needs to be the focus in terms of our connectivity strategy moving forward, and focusing on 5G in particular in rural and remote areas. And you could even start to focus on, okay, well, what are the communities and what are the farming regions that we really need to unlock first, and then go from there if we want to get even more specific. But I think when we kind of look historically, we've had great productivity leaps in terms of genetics and breeding and farm mechanization. And the next unlock is really around technology. And we can't have that if we don't have 5G access. So, well, 5G part in your case.
Well, and I think one of the key parts too is this goes back to your marketing and communication, and this is more national than global, is that if everybody believes that energy, agriculture, and critical minerals are what drive us out of our, our current GDP mess and need to increase productivity, what we need to remember is like there are no farms, mines, or drilling rigs in downtown Regina or downtown Toronto. However, a large number of jobs in downtown Regina and downtown Toronto exist because of those farms, mines, and drilling rigs. And so we get in this debate of should we invest in 5G in rural Saskatchewan? I mean, there's only 25,000 people in that area and it's going to cost us too much. Yeah, but that 25,000 people is creating X million jobs in all the cities. And that's why we're investing in it. And I think that's got to be one of our biggest disconnects between rural and urban is, yes, there's less people, but GDP growth drive, and the reason cities exist, a lot of cases is tied to those three industries and they all take place in rural.
Absolutely. And you could use the food and beverage manufacturing as as an example of that. It's now the largest by revenue manufacturing industry in Canada, and it wouldn't exist without farms like yourself. So I think, yeah, that's an excellent point, making that connection to the success of the manufacturing that is happening in more urban settings.
Well, and I think, I mean, I brought this up on a social media post a couple of weeks back, and so I listened to the Elon Musk and Joe Rogan podcast, and Elon was talking about how one manufacturing job in one of his industries creates 5 jobs in the town around him, right? Whether it's diners, whether it's bankers, whether it's legal, whatever it might be. So, I mean, we look at the cities and we say, yeah, you're right. One oil job in the city creates 5 other jobs. Well, that one oil job came from rural Saskatchewan or rural Alberta. So, and yet we're still having trouble getting pipelines put through provinces in this country. So, I mean, I agree with you that the national energy, whatever you want to call it, natural resources needs to move. It can't move until something changes. And I don't want to say what that change is because I don't know, but I think we do know, but something has to change.
Well, I mean, I've said this publicly a bunch of times, right? Is how do we get the natural resource sector to have a seat at the big table in cabinet, right? The agriculture minister and energy minister and critical minerals, the people in charge of that are all in separate kind of ministries. And to be honest, in most cases, under most prime ministers, whether that be Liberal, Conservative, or NDP, they haven't been at the big table. So if that's what's going to drive it, then how do we get, whether it's one minister in charge of all three of those or a collaboration between the ministers to really have a voice at the table? Because it's such a big drive to finance and treasury. And yet I don't think it always gets heard.
Yeah.
But
and collaboration
across, think it doesn't.
Yeah, collaboration across natural resources, I think, is essential, given that point of that underlining infrastructure that we need, from internet connection to transportation to labor to building up kind of those rural towns that we need next to those more manufacturing focused facilities. And so that really needs to be elevated if we're going to achieve kind of the growth that we've outlined in the report. It's very focused on trade, but there's a lot of domestic issues that really need to be surfaced.
Okay, I think we've got Lisa in trouble enough today, Hughes. So let's give her the floor at the end here. Is there anything in the report that we haven't touched on that you want to touch on or just bring to light, I guess would be the last question.
I think it's really important to bring to light that while our share is declining, and there are certainly challenges, there is a lot of opportunity for Canada, and there's a lot of appetite for what Canada has to offer the world. And I think over the next decade and starting now, getting focused on enabling that growth to unlock our potential, from productivity on the farm to expansion and capacity of manufacturing, are really kind of where there is opportunity to grow. And I think farms like yourselves and processors, we've mentioned AGT, it's really kind of learning from those growth opportunities that you've taken advantage of and moving that into the future. So I think, yes, we kind of get down on the Canadian story, but I think there is a lot to be positive about and to be hopeful about in terms of where we have opportunities to grow.
Perfect. The real voice in the room. I like it.
I mean, we could cave you at that too. I mean, we're passionate about what needs to change because, to be honest, if I really, really wanted to, could sell out and retire right now and live in whatever country I want if Canada pisses me off. But I don't. The reason we care about this is our kids and grandkids in the country, right? And so we're two accountants that left public accounting and went into the world of agriculture because we believe so much in the opportunity and invest millions in that, right? We got our wallet in the game. So, I mean, we're the same. The opportunities are endless. It's just can we encourage everybody to capture them?
Well, I don't have my wallet. I have your wallet in the game. So. All right. So Heaves, I know you got one question you ask everybody, so I'm going to let you finish this up. You hit her with the last one.
Hit her with the last one. Yeah. So, I mean, I usually ask, and I always say it's because it's interesting, but it's kind of selfish. I like to get everybody's answers so it helps my brain. But, you know, where do you think agriculture is going to be in 10 years? That's the overarching question. The first part, though, is, you know, what needs to happen for us to get there? And then 2, what's a constant? What's going to stay the same that we can rely on as we're taking that trek?
Oh, I think it's in the report. No, I'm just joking.
Nice.
In 10 years, if we really kind of buckle down on our growth prospects, increasing our market share, I think, is where I hope and where I think Canada can be in terms of exports. Increasing exports translates to growth domestically. What we need to do, we need to get focused on those growth markets internationally. I think, yes, of course, the U.S. is going to be maintained as an important relationship. China and Japan, those relationships we have, but there are a lot of opportunities in those areas that, like Southeast Asia, Latin America, Middle East, North Africa, their population is growing and their GDP is growing, but our competitors are moving in a lot faster than we are. So that is, I think, where we really need to get focused on. And internally, it's really about kind of managing our budget and reorientating it towards growth. So I think getting very focused on that, and that comes from, you've mentioned this, leadership and exploring kind of where there are opportunities to really focus on the outcomes that we want to produce.
There you go, Ev.
Perfect. Okay, so that's another one. And thank you for jumping on with us, Lisa, and spending the last hour with us, getting Kristjan in trouble, hopefully on social, not me this time. So, and for those listening, that's the truth about ag. Thanks for joining us. The Truth About Ag podcast is a proud member of the Heber Group, which includes Heber Grain Ventures, Maverick Ag, and Farmer Coach. We appreciate the support. Lastly, please like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell. And if you have questions for a future podcast, please leave in the comments below. Thanks for listening.